Buddy, we're back with another podcast, timestamping editing session. I hope you guys are all doing quite well. I'm going to begin the podcast now and I will soon start the game. Thank you.
A week and a half ago, and it's still setting in, I think. Kind of still in shock over here. How about you?
I'm definitely shocked and a little taken back, but I've been doing a lot of reflecting and questioning my own assumptions and questioning the movements that have been happening in the country and around the globe. We've seen events like Brexit, and, a lot of people are actually calling this America's Brexit.
I've heard that, and I think it's time for us to pay attention, get curious, ask some questions, start to recognize some patterns. And most importantly, I think it's a really important time that we be inclusive and united and not divisive.
Yeah, it's always a little tense after an election, and we're seeing that right now with a lot of anger and frustration in the public. But after everything calms down and people work through their emotional reactions, I think we can get to a place of unity again.
I hope so. And I hope that it carries a tune that's not just red and blue, but that we start to get curious about other parties and not see this simply as a two-party system.
I am very hopeful for expanding the two-party system and giving our citizens more options and more power, ultimately, to select the president that they deem will make positive changes. Because more than ever, this election was more driven by who people did not want in office, more than who they did want in office. And I don't know what the implications of that will be, but it's very interesting, and I'm hopeful for the future.
I am too.
Me
Definitely
too.
making history, and we should dive into this episode.
When all else fails, Angie, we always have each other. We have this wonderful podcast, and we have wine.
What could go wrong with that?
It's a bit of an old interview.
Welcome to the Human Current,
Where we have casual conversations about complexity.
in work, life, and all the things we do.
It's time to get curious.
And curiouser.
Haley, I loved our last series on politics, but I gotta be real with you. I am glad that they are behind us.
I'm thrilled that there is no longer countless voting calls to my cell phone and political ads on TV, and the whole thing is behind us so we can move forward as a nation.
For real. And speaking of moving forward, I really just want us to move forward with this episode because, as you know, I'm really excited about airing the interview that I had with Professor David Snowden.
It was pretty comical to see how giddy you got the night before your interview, texting me saying, there's only 12 hours till I talk to him. And I thought it was really cute. But also, I'm happy that this interview happened.
It was really fascinating, wasn't it, when you had to listen?
It was extremely fascinating. I've actually listened
So
to the
frustrating.
interview about 5 times, and I am still having to
hurts my
slow it
eyes.
down and digest some of the stuff that he says.
Yeah, I would
Alright,
agree.
I'm not
And
gonna
as you know,
subject
Haley,
guys to that. Properties.
listeners that aren't aware of who Professor David Snowden is,
Okay, just
he's a
stop.
complexity thinker, public speaker, a founder of Cognitive
Why?
Edge, which is a consulting company and research network
This is
focusing
how it
on
ends.
complexity theory and sense making.
Whoop.
He's doing some pretty incredible work, not only with his company, which he founded, but also with the grassroots
go.
movement with nonprofits
Gotta go,
and
dude.
government agencies.
I don't have time to stick
He
around.
says that he's working with human systems by combining a couple different practices. He's combining complex adaptive systems theory with cognitive neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy to create a whole new theory of what systems are about.
Oh,
So, Angie, let's have a listen to the interview. We're going to switch it up just a little bit this time and stop the interview midway so we can digest some of the information and the knowledge bombs that Snowden drops on us.
Yeah, because I know when we were listening to it, we were having a little WTF, this is so brilliant. And I think that little break in between will be helpful. Plus, I might add, finding an interview time was really challenging for Snowden and myself, but I was thrilled when we were finally able to connect over Skype while he was at an event in California. So keep that in mind, because the audio has some background noises here and there, but we don't actually think it's too distracting. So I started the interview with asking about the work that Professor Snowden is currently doing and what makes him passionate about his work.
Let's take a listen.
I fall into sort of two categories. One is the Cognitive Edge, which is the commercial company. And there we're working on a mixture of software development, but also I'm doing, for example, today I'm doing a use of narrative for communication with Cisco over 2 to 3 days. So that kind of like work is classic consultancy, sense-making, application of Kinevin, which is my sense-making framework complexity. And I tend to do sort of high-level, C-level stuff on that along with the rest of the company. The other element is the stuff we just set up at Bangor University in Wales, which is the research centre, and that's focused on government, NGOs and academics. And there we're starting to look at things like, for example, how do you trigger social workers to a heightened state of alert when the plausibility of child abuse is high? We're doing programmes at the moment across Wales and the northeast of England to try and understand the street narrative to find out why people voted for Brexit when it wasn't in their self-interest to do so. So trying to get to grips with the sort of post-fact society in terms of how we understand street stories. We're about to launch projects on understanding project management from a complex perspective, user requirements capture. So a body of collaborative research projects there, but the fundamental principle is treating human systems as a complex ecology rather than a complicated machine. And for the last 3 or 4 decades, we've been using a mechanical metaphor for what is fundamentally an organic entity.
That's fascinating. And I love your work on using narratives and your approach of keeping humans in mind as you do this work. And that's really what's leading the charge and leading where your work is at. Professor Snowden, we understand that you are a complexity thinker. How would you define complexity, and how did you become interested in complexity?
I'm so screwed.
We're really talking about complex adaptive systems theory here, and that really goes back to probably precision in chemistry, though you can trace it back.
The dancing man never dies.
And moves into biology with people like Stu Kaufman, into economics with people like Brian Arthur. It's fundamentally the science of systems which are inherently uncertain, the science of uncertainty. So it's systems where there's no predictable cause and effect. And the way I like to say it is complex adaptive systems don't have causality, they have dispositionality. So at any one stage, you can say the system is disposed to behave in this way, but you can't predict that it will. Now, most human systems work in that fashion, and it gives us effectively, we needed radical new theory of management. Now, complexity itself really divides into 3. There's sort of a residual element within systems thinking, but that tends to be causal. You'll find people, for example, taking Stafford Beer's VSM model and saying it's a complex system, which it isn't. I think if Beer had been born 30 years later, he'd have picked up complexity, but it wasn't available when he was working. That's kind of like one group. Then you get the groups associated with Santa Fe and elsewhere who are really about modeling what I call computational complexity. That's kind of like birds fly around in the sky based on 3 simple rules. Follow the next bird, match speed, avoid collision. And if you add a rule about leadership swapping on a time interval, you get the V shape that geese form when they fly in the sky. Italian drivers, by the way, south of Naples, work on the same principles. That's actually been studied. The field I'm developing, and other people in linked fields, but I call it anthrocomplexity. And we're saying that you can't treat human beings like you can treat termites' nests or flocking behavior of birds. Because humans have self-awareness, they have intelligence, they switch between identity structures, they can exercise altruism beyond kinship group, they have language, which is symbolic in nature rather than naming things. So there are huge additional levels of complexity when you deal with human systems. So what we're doing is to combine complex adaptive systems theory with cognitive neuroscience, the biological end of anthropology, with a body of work in psychology and philosophy, effectively to create a new theory of what systems are about.
So you just mentioned anthrocomplexity, and when we interviewed Sonia Blechner from More Beyond, she mentioned this anthrocomplexity and said that you could speak best to this term. Can you describe anthrocomplexity?
It's this concept that human beings are different, all right? So let's run through key differences. Art comes before language in human evolution. So we learned to sort of draw paintings on the walls of caves before we learned language. So humans constantly work at a high level of abstraction.
Come on.
In evolutionary terms, this has massive advantage because if you shift up to a level of abstraction, things can combine and recombine in different ways. Yeah, Mary Midgley, a British philosopher, famously argued that physicists who were poets were better physicists because they were more capable of rapid innovation. It's why, incidentally, the focus of a core curriculum and the neglect of arts is actually to diminish human intelligence, and that's problematic.
You'll never get me.
So language and the symbolic nature, the abstract nature of language in humans makes us unique as a species. We also switch between identities. So when my daughter phoned me up many years ago and said she'd had a car accident, my identity became father and everything else was pushed to the sidelines until I knew she was okay. Then other roles started to come into play. And human beings have got very sophisticated at this. So, for example, the ritual when a pilot goes into the cockpit of an aeroplane or a surgeon goes into operating theatre, ritual aligns identity with roles so that forms of behaviour are possible that are not possible outside of that. Another concept from philosophy and anthropology, which is the concept of assemblages. As we tell stories about our life, other people repeat those stories or modify or change them. And sooner or later, bodies and stories get existence independent of their creators, and that's called an assemblage, and to reference back to Deleuze. And the assemblage creates downwards causation. We can't escape it except under extreme stress. And you can see that with the example for the way that congenital idiots like Donald Trump are actually being successful, because they're triggering assemblage structures rather than arguing rationally or in a sensible way. But they're falling into a pattern of belief that people want to follow. And so that the upside of our ability to handle abstraction is our ability to be deceived into mob rule or mob violence or the tyranny of dictators. So all of that means that we need to see complexity in human beings as a different field of study from complexity in biological systems, and economical systems, and animal behavior. And there's more than that, but that's kind of like a rough summary.
I appreciate that definition on anthrocomplexity. It sounds like there's a rooted piece to that around people having agency.
Actually, not people having agency, but identities and artifacts having agency. I think there's a huge difference in philosophy between what's called social atomism and communitarianism. Social atomism, which dominates Northern Europe and the USA, and is linked with Protestantism and market capitalism, assumes that all society is an aggregation of individual choice and individual self-interest. Communitarianism, which dominates Africa, Asia, Southern Europe, the Celtic fringe of Britain, basically says that human beings are primarily defined by the societies of which they're a part, i.e. the identity is predominant. And really all the stuff we now know from cognitive neuroscience and elsewhere backs up communitarian concepts. So the agent is an identity, or it can be an artifact, or it can be a tool. Sometimes it's an individual, but it's more an identity, a clan, a tribe, or something like that.
Thank you for that clarification.
It's so brilliant how Snowden draws this distinction between birds and human behavior.
Yeah, many people compare bird flocking behavior with human systems. And there's even some studies being done about bird flocking theory being applied to Italian drivers, as Snowden shared in his interview. Much like birds flocking, when we drive, we tend to go on autopilot. But the difference between us and birds is that we operate at a high level of abstraction. We have so many other levels of complexity and identity structures that we deal with on a daily basis. And like you said earlier to me, Haley, while we were listening to the interview, you said, birds just have to be birds.
Thanks, Angie.
Okay.
You're right. This high level of abstraction that we as humans operate within is what Professor Snowden calls anthrocomplexity, and it's a term that he coined. And I love how he gives the example about his daughter being in a car accident and that his identity as a father overtook all his other identities until he knew she was safe. So his identity as a father became the agent.
Yeah, I can just imagine as a father and his daughter getting into an accident, all the emotions that play into that situation. And it reminds me of our interview with Spencer. You know, when he talks about all of our decisions being based on emotion. And in fact, unless we're doing a math problem, we can't make a decision. We have to rely on emotion to make decisions. So I can imagine Snowden's example, being a father with his daughter in an accident, the emotional charge that comes with that, and frankly, the irrational decisions that he may have made, because as we know from Spencer's interview, that's what we do as humans. And so the identity really shifts, and that then overshadowing his identity. So he was no longer Professor Snowden at that time. He became father to his daughter. And I think that that's a realistic picture of how we are just as humans versus, again, the flocking of birds. You know, we talk often here at the Human Current about going from co-hosts here and our other duties here to going home and being wife or mother or community contributor, and what that looks like and how we have to shift our identities.
Yeah.
So along with identity as being an agent, Snowden also talks about artifacts. And an artifact can be something like a story or artwork or something that's been passed down throughout human history. And that has agency within humans and human systems as well. Snowden says art comes before human language and evolution. Yet creative arts and art expression has really been taken out of our school systems.
Yeah, it does feel like it's kind of undervalued these days. Not only in the school systems, but even when I think of my sphere of parents and where they would lie their values and their expectations for their kids. I don't often hear them say they want their kids to excel in any sort of art field.
It's actually discouraged most of the time and not seen as something that will lead to success. But it actually is a very powerful form of creative intelligence.
Yeah, and talk about creativity being hindered by studying subjects in isolation. More linear and reductionist thinking rather than connecting dots with a holistic and immersive education process.
I think creativity really has been hindered in our educational system because we use a more linear process. We think in subject matters and we put them in their isolated categories and we don't connect the dots in any way. And it just makes me wonder, what are the unintended consequences of devaluing the arts? And moving forward as a society and as a culture, where do we go from here?
Yeah, because surely that reductionist thinking doesn't come with great benefit for us and for society. You know, just going back to what you were saying with Snowden pointing out that language stems from art. We couldn't even be having this casual conversation without some form of art expression.
Well, if you think about what he said of the cave paintings, that's how we started communicating and leaving our legacy for the next generation. And if you think about beyond our communities and our school systems, in the workplace, how often is our identity not taken into consideration beyond employee? So the employer doesn't factor in your other identities as being the agent of how you're going to act in the workplace.
Yeah, and we talk about this here at the Human Current. We're whole people. We bring our whole self to work or to home or to our communities, and that's our asset, not our deficit. And even though we shift within our identities throughout the day, we bring all of them with us no matter where we go. And that and our language, which stems from art, shapes our culture. So having a culture at work or having a culture in our community, a culture within our family is really essential. And you can stem back, thousands of years and study culture in different groups and the value that comes from that and passing that on from generation to generation. And it makes me really sad to think that some of that may be going away, and makes me also wonder if we're missing out on something really important. Maybe something's being influenced or persuaded from outside factors rather than our own narratives, like it has been for so many centuries.
Like Snowden says, we can't escape causation. So we really need to look at the implications that may be emerging from this trend in our society. And I'm so thrilled that Snowden is creating a movement. He's coined a term, anthro-complexity, and creating narratives around the study of the complexity of humans as their own category, because it's a different field. It's different than biology, economics, or animal behavior.
Yeah, I would agree. And while I was interviewing Snowden and he was talking about humans being a different study of complexity, it really became clear to me that he is a true complexity thinker versus a systems thinker, which we've had many on our show. And we love having systems thinkers and complexity thinkers join the conversation here at the Human Current. But while I was interviewing him, it became so apparent that I actually asked him how he compares complexity thinking to systems thinking. And that's actually the question coming up next in this interview.
So let's jump in. Let's hear his response to that question, and let's listen to the rest of the interview.
This is controversy, and they've actually made me a professor of systems at Hull University, knowing that I disagree with the use of systems, but that's life. I think systems thinking really comes out of cybernetics and elsewhere back in the 70s and 80s. In fact, you can trace it back to the 50s or earlier. Not all systems thinking does this, but certainly in its popular form, Hammer and Chamfrey, Michael Porter, Balanced Scorecard, Nanaka. All of these people basically assume that you have systems which will have causality, even though they have multiple loops within those causal systems. So a system can be designed, it can be modeled. From my point of view, complexity, which comes from an organic system, is dispositional, not causal. And that divide is much bigger. A friend of mine at Hull defines systems thinking as thinking systematically. Well, that's so general, I don't think it's useful. So the divide between dispositional and causal systems for me is fundamental. And it's actually quite interesting. I think complexity thinking has more in common with scientific management than it does with systems thinking in popular form. And I had the privilege of teaching leadership with Drucker before he died, and that was the conclusion we came to. Because if you look at scientific management, it provides physical augmentation and structured augmentation for human decision-making. But it keeps the apprentice model of learning, it keeps the concept of hierarchies and human judgment. What we see with the popular forms of systems thinking in the late 70s, 80s is an attempt to reduce human judgment to processes, taking artisan capability and make it a manufacturing process. That's done with narrative, it's done with design thinking. And to try and reduce human judgment to a series of structured cause and effect relationships which can be explicitly managed. Now, from an anthro-complexity point of view, we're saying that's fundamentally flawed. We can provide cognitive augmentation and cognitive extension of human intelligence, but we still need to have human judgment in the equation. And we're not dealing with systems which are predictable or causal. So the ability to model is only ever partial and is actually quite dangerous if you think it's incomplete. So I think a lot of us are still talking about this and we haven't settled on the terms, but we need to make those sorts of distinctions.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction. I first heard those distinctions in your article in Harvard Business Review. I'm a big fan of your work, and in particular, the Cynefin framework, which was discussed in the Harvard Business Review among countless other places. And we'll include that link and your short video on the Cynefin framework in our show notes. So as a total side note, I actually recently finished my master's degree in leadership at Royal Roads University, and myself and many other fellow learners also quoted much of your work and sourced it, and we really appreciated that definition between systems thinking and complexity thinking. So those ideas are represented in the Cynefin framework, and I'm wondering, can you describe this framework and who it serves?
It's actually interesting. Most management models you see are kind of like derived from a single study. Cynefin kind of like emerged over multiple interactions with people in issues, and as I read more material, the model itself changed. Primarily early influence there was Boasso. In fact, people like Boasso and Giuraro heavily contributed on the theory side. And then people like Sharon Darwin, Cynthia Kurtz, and Nix and various other people contributed on method development over the years. So Cynefin has evolved and changed. In fact, there's a new version of it coming out this afternoon once I teach it, which deals with constraints in a different way. So it has the value, it's adapted. It's what I call a sense-making framework. It's designed to help people make sense of the world so that they can act in it. And as such, it creates boundaries, because if you create boundaries, human beings, when they cross a boundary, know they can behave differently. So it deals with three fundamental types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. So ordered systems are ones which are so heavily constrained that all behavior is predictable. In Cynefin, they divide into two types: obvious order, where the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident and accepted by everybody. So, for example, in Britain, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In America, they drive on the right-hand side of the road. Those are accepted conventions, and they produce stability. Complicated order, on the other hand, requires analysis or expertise, but there is still causality, there is still a right answer. And then we get complex adaptive systems, which I've described before, which have what are called enabling constraints. So they have loosely coupled structures which create coherence but not predictability. And then chaotic systems have effectively no connections, no coupling, which means if they happen accidentally, they're a disaster. But if you can create that system, and we're doing this, for example, for mass citizen engagement. So by presenting a question to 1,000, 200,000 people simultaneously and seeing how they interpret it, you can create a new objective real-time approach to decision-making. But the lack of connectivity is key. And the final two elements of Cynefin are the central domain of disorder, which means we don't know which of the main domains we're in, and the fact that the obvious domain is next to the chaotic domain, because if you over-constrain a system which can't naturally be constrained, sooner or later you have a catastrophic failure into chaos. So Cynefin is a sense-making framework. It's designed to pass the back of the table napkin test. You should be able to draw any framework on the back of the table napkin from memory. It's designed to help people make sense of the world. It's designed to allow them to have conversations they wouldn't otherwise have. Its most revolutionary aspect is what I described in an article called Multi-Ontology Sense-Making. It basically says there are different ontologies, and by that I mean a philosophical sense, i.e. different types of system, different ways in which the world operates. And epistemology, the way you know things, the way you make decisions, has to follow the ontology, the way things are. Now, that's the really radical aspect of Cynefin, and I think one of the reasons why it's taken off, it's got huge citations, is because it allows you to say, in this context we do that, but in this other context we do something completely different and contradictory. Whereas really for the last 40 or 50 years, people have adopted a single ontology approach, the assumption that there is actually one right answer. I think the power of Cynefin, and it's been used for everything from counterterrorism to understanding hospital interactions to SWAT teams in Florida to, well, I'm losing count.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited that you're able to talk about the new Cynefin on the day that we're chatting.
It will get blogged tonight.
Yeah, that's great. By that point, we'll be able to link it to the show notes as well. So excellent. We recently learned about Cognitive Edge's SenseMaker software suite. Can you tell us about SenseMaking and who is it geared towards?
SenseMaker is effectively a distributed ethnography tool or a self-ethnography tool. So we know there are fundamental problems with things like questionnaires in that they're evaluative. And people know what the right answer is. They know what answer you're expecting. I mean, with things like Net Promoter Score these days, everybody wants to know, would you recommend our product to a friend? And you know what answer the respondent is wanting. We know that focus groups are biased within 15 minutes by the facilitator. We know that traditional longitudinal research is subject to heavily biased by the person who tags the data and takes a huge amount of time to produce material. So if you're dealing with a complex adaptive system, the system is constantly fluxing and changing, and opportunities when they come have to be seized. So we need fast real-time feedback systems which are descriptive, not evaluative. Because if people describe the situation, it opens up more possibilities than if they evaluate it. And both in terms of research authenticity, but also in terms of power, I wanted people to be responsible for the interpretation of their own, what are called micro-narratives or micro-observations. So what SenseMaker allows people to do is to describe the situation either through survey format or through continuous journaling format, the latter is preferred, and to self-interpret that into a quantitative framework at the point of origin. There's actually a video which describes this as well on YouTube. And that self-interpretation is key because a quantitative approach allows us to scale to huge volumes of data capture in real time and to map the dispositional states. So we can now make statements about, for example, underlying culture or attitudes. And attitudes and culture are lead indicators, whereas things like compliance with legal systems are lag indicators, which means we're working in areas like safety, child abuse, citizen engagement, health areas. So SenseMaker is precisely that. It allows human metadata to be created using high abstraction principles. It's been a lot easier to sell it since the Internet of Things came along, because effectively the Internet of Things is a mechanical sensor. SenseMaker is a human interpretive sensor to overlay on the mechanical data. So it's a generic tool which then gets sculpted and positioned into specific applications.
Thanks for that little background. I'm a big fan of using qualitative, and I appreciate your work in bringing the narratives into a qualitative approach and understanding.
It's more quantitative. My background is physics and philosophy, so I'm not wild about qualitative research. What I want to do is make qualitative research quantitative.
So taking the narratives and being able to apply.
Yeah, the narratives in SenseMaker are explainums for the statistical patterns derived from the self-interpretation. Which means we can capture in people's own dialect or language. We can capture pictures, we can capture voice, we can capture combinations. We're not dependent on secondary interpretation. So it's technically, it's a mixture of quant and qual, but it's primarily a quantitative technique, which is why it scales.
Oh, interesting. I did find that video on YouTube really useful, and same with the videos that are on Cognitive Edge's website. So we'll include those in our show notes.
Because I'm 35 kilograms heavier in those videos. I'm getting embarrassed by it.
Professor Snowden, what is a takeaway related to complexity? Maybe something that our listeners can do.
You manage in the present by parallel safe-to-fail experimentation. You don't manage to future states. That's the most key thing. So, for example, you don't announce a change initiative because everybody's been through too many of those and you'll get a negative reaction. You start to make changes. But you don't do fail-safe design. You do safe-to-fail parallel experimentation. That's probably the key thing.
Nice and simple. It sounds simple, at least, doesn't it?
It's simple, but it's not simplistic. The trouble is a lot of people, they subordinate complexity language to old methods. I'm not sure whether that's putting old wine into new wineskins or new wine into old wineskins, but either way, it's a bad idea. And they don't realize just how radically different complexity is. You manage the present, and you manage the things you can manage, and you don't manage to define future states. And that really is radical compared with what complexity is.
To me, that sounds like a good difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking as well.
Yeah, it's another way of defining it. Good point.
Is there anything that we've missed?
Oh, there's a whole body of stuff on this, yeah. You know, attentional bias and all those sort of aspects of it. But no, I think we got the essence across in what we can do.
Excellent.
Help me.
Professor Snowden, how can our listeners find you?
Departure Lands of Airports in my second home.
Right.
The Cognitive Edge website, which you provide a link to, I can be emailed through that, or the Nevin Centre at Bangor University, which is just building its website at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being on the Human Current, and we look forward to learning more about your work and following your new work that's coming out on Connecting.
Okay, real pleasure.
You are no help, teammates. You are no help.
While I was interviewing Professor Snowden, I found it really interesting to learn about Cognitive Edge's SenseMaker and the Cynefin framework.
Yeah, his interview was very telling, and I also have watched a short video about the Cynefin framework just to go a little deeper, which is available on his website. And it describes the framework in 4 categories: simple order, complicated order, complex systems, chaotic systems. And then there's this middle area, which is disorder. And that's not knowing what space you're operating within. And he really breaks it down to explain the importance of context. And it's so brilliant, it's difficult to put into words. But it's a great way for leaders to evaluate a problem or a situation and to figure out where they lie within this framework so that they can set a plan of action.
Yeah, and the sense-making framework really identifies the boundaries. And as Snowden said, when humans know they cross boundaries, then they can correct their behavior. And that made me actually think about our interview with Angela Montgomery. She talked about harnessing human potential, which has some similarities to the sense-making framework that Snowden discussed.
And I loved Snowden's takeaway this episode because it reminded me of an episode that you and Stacy had in the past called Trust the Process. He emphasizes focusing on small actions in the present and using safe-to-fail intervention and experimentation. So that allows you to amplify what works and nudge the system in the direction that you want to go in using real-time feedback.
I think there's huge value in the real-time feedback and monitoring that. And Sonia Blucknut also talked about this to some extent in her interview. I feel like after this interview, I want to go back and listen to a whole bunch of old episodes.
It's really tying them all together, right?
Which is kind of fun to go back and listen to them all, especially as we're approaching the end of the year. You know, we only have one more episode left.
One more episode in 2016 is behind us. Isn't that crazy?
The election is behind us. The episodes for this year will be behind us.
But you know what's in front of us, Angie? This delicious wine from Wales.
Oh, yes. We're definitely celebrating our interview with Professor Snowden today. I love a good Welsh wine.
And the Welsh people. They're not so bad either.
Yes. I was thrilled that we could air Professor Snowden's interview today. And how about this wine, this Pinot Noir, in spirit of Snowden's interview? Thank you so much, Snowden, for taking some time to chat with me so the Human Current and our listeners could learn from you. What is our Welsh wine that we are drinking?
Encur Hill Estates Pinot Noir 2013.
So how about a cheers to complexity thinking and a cheers to Professor David Snowden.
Thank you, Snowden. Cheers.
Cheers. Until next time,
let's work happy.
All right. That was the Dave Snowden interview.
This episode of The Human Current is brought to you by the 9th International Conference on Complex Systems, hosted by the New England Complex Systems Institute. We have the Institute's president, Professor Yanir Baryam, with us to tell us more about their upcoming conference. Yanir, we've learned the 9th International Conference on Complex Systems is taking place in Cambridge, Massachusetts this year, from July 22nd to the 27th. Tell us a bit more about this conference and who is it for?
So the science of complex systems enables us to really expand what science applies to, applying new mathematical tools to a wide range of systems, physical systems, biological systems, social and technological ones. And so this conference really enables us to re-explore what is the quantities or properties of the world that we want to understand and how the advances in science can enable us to develop better understanding. Scientists can present their work and also discover new topics that they may be interested in studying in the future. The conference is well suited to students, postdocs, and faculty, as well as professionals that are really interested in a broad exposure to the nature of science. And the last day of the meeting is on artificial intelligence, which is important not only because of the fundamental scientific advances that are embodied in it and the technological advances, but the way it is affecting society and what we can expect in the future.
We hope our listeners will learn more and register for the conference by visiting necsi.edu/events or find a link on our website at human-current.com. We're honored to be official podcasters for this conference. We will be attending the event and interviewing conference speakers, so be sure to stay tuned.
I thought that was a dude's head.
Welcome to the Human Current,
where we have casual conversations about complexity
in work, life, and all the things we do.
It's time to get curious
and curious. Today on The Human Current, we have with us Jon Kolko, who's a designer and educator. We first talked with Jon in 2016, and we discussed complexity, design, and problem solving. We're very excited to have him back on the show. Hi, Jon. Thanks for being on The Human Current.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
It's a privilege to have you back on the show, a fellow Austinite. So please introduce yourself to our listeners, along with telling us about the work you're currently doing and what makes you passionate.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. My name's Jon, and I'm a partner at Modernist Studio. This is a strategy agency that we formed here in Austin about a year ago, where we focus on driving design strategy, sometimes called design thinking, and then tactical execution for large corporate clients, where we solve complex problems and drive the ideas of creativity that are in that book that I think we're going to spend some time talking about today through their organizations. I'm also the founder of Austin Center for Design, which is an educational institution here in Austin that teaches interaction design and social entrepreneurship. And I continue to teach there. And I wrote a new book called Creative Clarity. And the book is a little bit about what I alluded to that Modernist does. It's about helping large corporations understand what creativity is and how to bring it inside of their confines, and then how to manage it so that it doesn't spiral out of control. And the book delves into some tactical topics about what individual managers or practitioners can actually do to help foster creativity in their teams. And so as we dive into some of that, I think we'll get into some of the topics like critique and the idea of vision and framing and things like that through some of the future questions. In terms of what I'm passionate about and what makes me excited, most recently I've been thinking a lot about the ideas of what craft means in the context of strategy. I think many designers think a lot about craft in execution when they make things, when you make artifacts, whether they're physical artifacts like chairs and tables or digital artifacts like mobile phone apps or websites. And there's a level of sort of cleanliness to the things we make, but craft means something in strategy as well. So I've been playing around with what those ideas mean, because I think when you start to bring creativity inside of an organization, increasingly the people you bring in are being asked to wear both practitioner hats, tactical hats, but also a strategic lens on the work that they're doing. And so being able to drive that precisely and with a sense of rigor becomes really, really important.
Great. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about your background. When we spoke to you last in 2016, you were working as the VP of Design at Blackboard, which is a leading education software company. And you had founded originally MyEDU, and it had been acquired by Blackboard. So I know that you were definitely in a creative lead position at that job, and it seems like all of your projects now are really based around this idea of what creative work really looks like. So it's really inspiring, and you have so much experience to really back up what you're talking about.
Well, thank you. Just a point of clarification, I didn't found MyEDU. I was just an employee there. I was the VP of Design and focused on product innovation. And so I got to interact with a lot of the people that were some of the original sort of brain trust of that. And then when we got acquired by Blackboard, I was able to apply some of the mentality and style that was in place at that startup, that sort of lean and loose, move quickly attitude, and try to bring some of that to that larger corporation. I have had a number of different diverse experiences that I think, in retrospect, were all purposeful and really well designed and planned. But obviously in the moment, your career path is very haphazard. But when I look back at it, I have had a chance to play an interesting and sometimes influential role in the idea of creativity in organizations.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying your role at MyEDU. It's also just really inspiring how that project led you into, the path of your career and really focusing on humanizing education software. So we do want to dive a little bit more into your book, which was recently released, called Creative Clarity, a practical guide for bringing creative thinking into your company. We'd like to know just why you wrote it, maybe a little more about it, and who should be reading it.
So the motivation for writing this was actually based on observing in my clients over and over a very similar behavior. And to contextualize this a little bit, these clients are Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 companies, very large organizations that have been gravitating toward any of the buzzwords du jour. So things like innovation and design thinking, and even things like lean and agile, they're sort of grasping at straws to try to understand how to behave in a new digital environment where things like existing business practices around quality and conservative thinking don't necessarily play a role anymore. And as I watched these companies struggle with how to integrate some of these buzzwords in a meaningful way, I realized that they actually have no idea what it means to have a creative culture. And for all of the conversations and articles and things that you find on the big Fast Company and Inc. magazine and Forbes that are all like, here's 10 ways to instill creativity in your organization. Here's 15 of these and 12 of those, there's sort of a lack of depth to the thinking around what it means to have a creative company. And so my motivation to write this was actually a little bit to help me understand what I was observing. Often when I write, it's to help me make sense of the world around me. And then a little bit to try to create something that's useful to people who are in roles where they're now being tasked with bringing that creativity into their companies. And they may be sort of looking around going, I really don't know what to do. And I'm sort of stuck in a place where the expectations are overwhelming and confusing. I see that in what I think is the target audience for this book, which is people in a mid or upper level leadership role who are given budgets and mandates to go be more creative or build a design team from 0 to 200 or work faster. And all of these are obviously things we hear all about. And I also think it's valuable for individual practitioners who are driving through their career path toward like a creative director role, where they may be the ones that are actually managing the creativity on a day-to-day basis. Those are the primary audiences for Creative Clarity.
I definitely encourage our listeners to grab a copy. It's really great. I mean, the title is Creative Clarity, but you really do demonstrate clarity in what you're talking about. And I love that you described writing the book to learn more about it. I think that that really helps to bring readers along on the journey because you bring them with you in that learning. It's definitely something that companies, leaders, and company culture is definitely one of those buzzword topics, but it is so complex when you talk about culture and what it means to actually change human behavior. So it's great to have some really tactical ways of approaching it and thinking about it. Where can our listeners grab a copy of your book?
So this book we self-published. I've had a number of books, some of which were with big publishers, some of which we self-published. I self-published this one along with some colleagues, and it's available on Amazon, both as a Kindle ebook as well as a print copy. And it's interesting to see the self-promotion cycle. This is an aside, I suppose, as compared to big publisher cycle. So I've published with Harvard as well as Oxford, and then now by myself, and to sort of watch the dynamic of these things change. There's sort of a grassroots style absorption of content like this as compared to sort of that top-down view of large companies saying, I should buy this because it was in a magazine I trust. And so I'm hoping that maybe some of the listeners here are looking for something less sterilized and more raw in their reading.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up. And you've had some other books that really speak to this topic as well, kind of in a different light. Your book, Well Designed, we talked about in our last episode. And so I'm curious to see the differences of how the books do based on their publishing, and hopefully our listeners do take that into consideration. So, Jon, I'm wanting to go more in depth with your book. In Chapter 1, you explain the process of framing and reframing problems, and you describe the role of boundaries and constraints in this process. Would you share more about this process and explain how it allows for a creative strategy to emerge?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that designers learn to love is the idea of constraints, and those can be juxtaposed with the idea of requirements. For many designers, when they hear requirements, they hear an arduous 30 or 40-page document with things that were written by somebody who doesn't understand people and is only focused on bottom line. And there's all sorts of whining that goes on when people absorb a requirements document, as compared to constraints, which are freeing. And it's not just a nomenclature change. Requirements are often mandated top-down before the actual creative exploration has happened. And so these may come from somebody who's looked externally at the market and identified a set of capabilities or features that will help them position a product or a business in a particular way in the market. Or these may be things that are emerging from technical constraints or technical enablers. But a constraint emerges actually from the creative exploration itself. What I mean by that is if a designer is working through a problem and they get to a place of insight where sort of a light bulb goes off, they may now have derived a series of constraints that can then help them move forward in their creative exploration. And this seems a little bit sort of high-level magic-y until you realize that when people are designing things, and they don't have to be designers to do this, anybody who is creative does this, they're literally making things up that didn't exist before. And so when you say, well, what should I make? You have a blank canvas, and so you need some sort of containment around that, a container in which to guide that exploration. And so these constraints become a freeing way for creative people to start to explore without having rules mandated at them, without having an autocratic perspective on it should do this, this, and this, and it should be like this, this, and this. Framing, then, is the way in which the problem is structured and presented, and the way those constraints start to manifest as an opportunity statement. And what that might look like is a very pragmatic approach versus a very broad approach. We're working with a banking company right now, and a couple ways to frame a problem. One might be you are designing a new way to handle online bill pay. And so that's a very sort of specific, pragmatic approach to product framing. Another might be you are designing a way for people to feel more in tune with the way they manage their money. And that's a much more experiential or emotional way of framing the problem. Both are correct. Obviously, both have room in a business or a problem, but they're going to lead to very, very different problem solutions and different ways of thinking about the opportunity and different constraint development. And so what I urge my designers to do when I'm managing people is to be very overt with what the problem frame is that they're pursuing, so that at any given time, anyone in the team can understand it, and therefore they can contribute in the context of those constraints in that particular frame effectively.
I just love the language around this type of framework. Freedom, opportunity statement. I mean, it sounds like a very liberating way to approach work. And it sounds like it really fosters and allows for people to think differently, think outside the box, to not be afraid to go beyond maybe policies, rules, or procedures. It's really exciting, and it definitely makes sense for enabling brilliant people to do what they do best.
Yeah, I agree that the language matters, and I also agree that it is sort of freeing and enabling. These aren't just words, right? They become the brand of how people think about their job. And there's a comparable in business that I can offer, which is some of us are old enough to remember the ideas of Six Sigma being pushed through organizations. And people who were trained in Six Sigma and the methods were often called black belts. And that's all sorts of weird and ridiculous, except that as a brand, then it enables and empowers the people who have that badge of honor to feel a certain way about the work they do. And so the language we use to describe our processes and the methods actually do describe either a creative environment or a rule-based environment. And if somebody says these are the requirements, it's as if they're saying, these are the rules and you need to behave by the rules. Nice. But if somebody offers you the opportunity to frame your problem, it gives you sort of the luxury for exploration. And even if those arrive in the exact same place, the attitude that a creative person will have along the way matters in terms of the execution. And so if I'm trudging along through this process or I'm skipping along with a smile on my face, the output is going to be dramatically different. This feels a little hippy-dippy, except that I've seen it play out both ways, where in a very staid conservative culture, people may be working on very exciting, impactful problems, but there's no passion. And because that sort of spark and inspiration isn't there, you can see in the work product that it's just not as exciting or thrilling or appropriate or beautiful or refined as it could be.
Yeah, it definitely takes some passion in really seeing that in the products and what your deliverables are. You can tell the difference when it's there and when it's not, for sure. I think that we see that play out with many popular brands today. And you can tell the cultures that really allow for creativity to exist and the ones that don't. I'm wondering what this has to do with values in an organization. In your opinion, what are some top values that an organization needs to enhance creativity?
I think one of the most important, we already just touched on briefly, is the idea of rules. It's been said a lot that creative people break the rules, but I think that there's actually really important signals around this that you can pick up on. And I'll juxtapose the way a rule-based culture presents itself to a creative culture. A rule-based culture is going to say things like, these are the policies that you have to follow. And one example of a policy in a rule-based organization is rules around what you can and can't do on your laptop. That it's locked down and you can't install software on your own. You have to get approval from a different organizational body. And there's very, very good reasons for that. Often that have to do with legal compliance, or that have to do with the sort of fear, or sometimes fear of spreading viruses or other sort of things that could bring down the entire network. But what that company is doing by pushing that rule onto the laptops is it's saying, we value the fear and risk mitigation of making sure that we're in compliance with policies or legal issues or making sure the network doesn't come down. We value that more than we value innovative thinking. That's an overt message that's being sent to people. And what that then plays out into are things like compensation differences and impact differences at an executive level. And so if we're saying that we value legal compliance more than we value innovation, then people in legal are going to have more of an impact and more of a say on the direction of the company than the creative people will. It sort of follows naturally. And obviously I have my bias about which is better, but I don't think that there's a blanket statement around that. I think it really dramatically matters on the industry. I'll tell you that as much as I would like my bank to be creative, I'd also like it to be locked down and very secure and safe so my data doesn't go anywhere. And that's a compromise as a consumer that I'm happy with them making. On the other hand, I do know that there's a variety of banks that are blowing up the way the industry currently thinks because they're starting to value creative development more than they're valuing things like legal risk. And one of the examples I give in the book is the company called Earnest. Earnest is a lender that has raised just a ton of venture capital and is doing really, really well. And just a brief anecdote about them, the way that they handle their underwriting is based on your bank account and the transactions and activity you have in it. And so basically you connect your bank account, they analyze your spending habits and your saving habits, and they deduce a credit risk report based on that, rather than all of the typical things that an insurer uses. And when I talked to some of the folks that work there in executive roles, they talked about how their culture is a creative one that values people like product managers and designers and developers more than potentially things like underwriters or lawyers or things that would probably be valued the most at a traditional insurance company. And so they've been able to rethink the way that the company runs in order to support the way that their innovative new products work. And so these are the types of trade-offs that you see in a creative company being made, where the prioritization around a rule-free or rule-based culture really comes into clarity.
It really sounds like the behaviors of the company instill values. Angie and I have joked about this before. It's not about having a ping pong table in the break room or a keg that says, oh, we're a playful culture. If you're not allowing that to show up in the employees' work, then it's not instilling that those are really, truly values to your company.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I wouldn't consider any of those indicators of a playful culture. I think they're indicators of a savvy recruitment culture, or at least in San Francisco, they're indicators of table stakes. You sort of have to have those things if you want to compete at a mid-level startup or a tech company, but those aren't indicators of a playful company any more than, a Nerf dart is or a basketball court is. When you talk to real creative people, that's noise. Yeah, they're happy to have it or they're not happy to have it, but it's not nearly as important as the quality of the work that they're doing, the freedom they have to explore, dedicated time away from distractions, empowerment to make their own decisions, the ability to learn from one another and be challenged by one another. These are the types of things that when you talk to creative people and creative organizations that they really, really value. And in many respects, they value them more than everything else. I don't think if you asked anybody, would you want to make less money, they're going to say yes. But for a lot of creative people, if you ask them sort of like, what are your top criteria for your job, money maybe isn't in the first 2 or 3. It's I want to get paid fairly, but it's definitely not a motivator for job selection.
I'm wondering how much trust plays a role in a creative culture, because you really need a lot of freedom and like you said, empowerment to do your job and really take risks. So would you say trust is one of those values that is really important to creative culture?
Yeah, I sure would. I mean, in many ways, if you take a risk, you need to be in a trusting environment. And if you think about what it means to create something from nothing, it's all about risk. You're basically saying, I'm staking a claim that the thing I'm about to make is, and you can complete the sentence, is good, is, valuable, is innovative, is wonderful, but I don't know for sure because I just made it. And then to put that on display for your colleagues to sort of rip apart or judge or examine really comes from a place of vulnerability. And so again, like a lot of these topics, you sort of have this hippy-dippy thing going on in the background. And I sort of have this like question mark around like, is this real or am I playing the granola hippie game here a little bit? But I do think that these things are real and they play out in really interesting ways during things like critique. And critique, I think, is one of the best sort of immediate indicators of a creative organization is do they have a culture of people looking at each other's work and offering ways to improve it. Critique has to come in an environment of trust. Imagine for a second being in a sort of less traditionally considered creative organization like a business development role or something like that, and putting your business development strategy up on the wall and then inviting all of your business development colleagues and your business development bosses and so on and so forth to come and tell you what's wrong with it. It's not something that a lot of people are used to if they haven't sort of grown up in a culture like that. I mean, this gets driven into your head in art school and design school and even now in computer science education. But for a lot of people, critique is new and they don't really get it. And so the rules around trust need to be articulated. The rules around critique need to be articulated. That's something that can't just happen instantially. It actually has to be sort of structured and shepherded. And I think a lot of that comes from transparency. I think a lot of it comes from overt expectation setting. A lot of it comes from being very direct in expectations, and a lot of this is sort of like traditional leadership stuff. It's things that you would find in management books about how to treat your team. So there's nothing sort of unique to my perspectives around this, but I do think that that idea of critique becomes one of the most important qualities of a creative organization, and it's something that can be really, really successfully fostered if it's done by design.
Yeah, and good design definitely takes into account feedback, especially user feedback and also feedback from your teammates. And in your book, you talk about this thing we call flow and how that helps with managing feedback. So we were hoping you could talk a little bit more about flow states and kind of how they facilitate managing feedback and how they help achieve creativity.
Yeah, sure. So I learned about flow when I was in grad school reading some work by a fellow named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And his work talks about and investigates what makes creative people creatively successful. And he's not very specific or detailed about who he means as creative. I think, it's very broad to him that it's people who create things. And so he spends time with these people and observes them and then extracts out some principles. And some of the principles of what he calls flow are things like dedicated amounts of time that are uninterrupted, things like a balance between ability and challenge, meaning that things are just hard enough. Things like having a clearly defined goal state is often supportive and helpful. And then he describes the quality of flows as having things like a lack of awareness of time, that, you look up and suddenly hours have passed and you're like, whoa, what happened to the world around me? Sort of a lack of awareness of self, that there's an autotelic quality to the work where you're almost observing yourself doing the work. And I've seen this play out in my own work in a number of different ways. Interestingly enough, when I started teaching, I actually started experiencing flow where I would be lecturing or talking or working, and I'd sort of get this sense of a meta perspective and go like, I don't have any idea what I'm saying, and I hope that it's valuable. So this sense of like self-awareness disappears. And I think part of that is the self-inner critique disappears too. You stop having that little voice in the back of your head saying like, this sucks, you suck, this isn't going to work, this work is garbage, and instead you just make the work. So if you think about what that requires in a corporate context, first and most obviously, it requires dedicated time. It requires blocks of 2 or 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted creative time, and that means no meetings, right? It means no conference calls. It means no mandatory training sessions, all the things that corporations like to have people do that aren't the work. And so that's a cultural shift around the expectations of what people are doing at any given time. Another thing it requires is work that's challenging. And again, there's this match between my ability and the challenge of the project, but the work needs to be challenging and therefore it can't be mindless. And so that means that people are put on projects that stress them. They're not put on a project where they can have a sense of mastery right away. And again, this introduces risk because if somebody's working on something that's directly sort of outside of their capability set, they may fail. Almost by design, they may not actually be able to achieve success there. And so again, that challenges sort of norms where you get a job based on your ability to check boxes on a requirement list that was given by a hiring manager to a recruiter, and then you do your job and you set goals and then you meet them and then you get promoted. It's sort of like a different way of thinking about what the expectations of you are in relationship to challenges and succeeding or failing.
This all seems to go back to having a trusting culture again.
Saved my life.
To reach these states where you are essentially eliminating your fear of failure and really making yourself vulnerable to the creative process, that takes an immense amount of trust and freedom to even get to that place. And then hopefully there's no meetings and other things to interrupt you from carrying out your states of flow. But yeah, it seems like this is all kind of tying back to what it means to have a creative culture.
But I'd lose my stuff.
Yeah, it really is. And I often think about the relationship I have with my students who are in a one-year program and the relationship I have with corporate students that I might come in and train for a week or something like that. In the first couple days of both training sessions, I have no ability to critique because I don't have their trust. So if I come in the